Chapter 8. The Persecution of Jerome of Prague. This reformer, who was the companion of Dr. Huss, and may be said to be a co-martyr with him, was born at Prague, and educated in that university, where he particularly distinguished himself for his great abilities and learning. He likewise visited several other learned seminaries in Europe, particularly the universities of Paris, Heidelberg, Cologne, and Oxford. At the latter place he became acquainted with the works of Wycliffe, and being a person of uncommon application, he translated many of them into his native language, having with great pains made himself master of the English tongue. On his return to Prague, he professed himself in open favor of Wycliffe, and finding that his doctrines had made considerable progress in Bohemia, and that Huss was the principal promoter of them, he became an assistant to him in the great work of Reformation. On the 4th of April, 1415, Jerome arrived at Constance about 3 months before the death of Huss. He entered the town privately, and consulting with some of the leaders of his party whom he found there, was easily convinced he could not be of any service to his friends. Finding that his arrival in Constance was publicly known, and that the council intended to seize him, he thought it most prudent to retire. Accordingly, the next day, he went to Eberling, an imperial town about a mile from Constance. From this place he wrote to the emperor and proposed his readiness to appear before the council if he would give him safe conduct, but this was refused. He then applied to the council, but met with an answer no less favorable than that from the emperor. After this he set out on his return to Bohemia. He had the precaution to take with him a certificate, signed by several of the Bohemian nobility, then at Constance, testifying that he had used all prudent means in his power to procure a hearing. Jerome, however, did not thus escape. He was seized at Hirsau by an officer belonging to the Duke of Sulzbach, who, though unauthorized so to act, made little doubt of obtaining thanks from the council for so acceptable a service. The Duke of Sulzbach, having Jerome now in his power, wrote to the council for directions how to proceed. The council, after expressing their obligations to the Duke, desired him to send the prisoner immediately to Constance. The Elector Palatine met him on the way, and conducted him into the city, himself riding on horseback, with a numerous retinue, who led Jerome in fetters by a long chain, and immediately on his arrival he was committed to a loathsome dungeon. Jerome was treated nearly in the same manner as Huss had been, only that he was much longer confined, and shifted from one prison to another. At length, being brought before the council, he desired that he might plead his own cause, and exculpate himself, which being refused him, he broke out into the following exclamation: "What barbarity is this? For 340 days I have been confined in a variety of prisons. There is not a misery, there is not a want, that I have not experienced. To my enemies you have allowed the full scope of accusation. To me you deny the least opportunity of defense. Not an hour will you now indulge me in preparing for my trial. You have swallowed the blackest calumnies against me. You have represented me as a heretic, without knowing my doctrine, as an enemy of the faith, before you knew what faith I professed. As a persecutor of priests before you could have an opportunity of understanding my sentiments on that head. You are a general council. In you, sinner, all this world can communicate of gravity, wisdom, and sanctity, but still you are men, and men are seducible by appearances. The higher your character is for wisdom, the greater ought your care to be not to deviate into folly. The cause I now plead is not my own cause. It is the cause of men. It is the cause of Christians. It is a cause which is to affect the rights of posterity, however the experiment is to be made in my person." This speech had not the least effect. Jerome was obliged to hear the charge read, which was reduced under the following heads: that he was a derider of the papal dignity, an opposer of the Pope, an enemy to the cardinals, a persecutor to the prelates, a hater of the Christian religion. The trial of Jerome was brought on the 3rd day after his accusation, and witnesses were examined in support of the charge. The prisoner was prepared for his defense, which appears almost incredible when we consider he had been there 340 days shut up in loathsome prisons, deprived of daylight and almost starved for want of common necessaries. But his spirit soared above these disadvantages, under which a man less animated would have sunk. Nor was he more at a loss of quotations from the fathers and ancient authors than if he had been furnished with the finest library. The most bigoted of the assembly were unwilling he should be heard, knowing what effect eloquence is apt to have on the minds of the most prejudiced. At length, however, it was carried by the majority that he should have liberty to proceed in his defense, which he began in such an exalted strain of moving elocution that the heart of obdurate zeal was seen to melt, and the mind of superstition seemed to admit a ray of conviction. He made an admirable distinction between evidence as resting upon facts and as supported by malice and calumny. He laid before the assembly the whole tenor of his life and conduct. He observed that the greatest and most holy men had been known to differ in points of speculation with a view to distinguish truth, not to keep it concealed. He expressed a noble contempt of all his enemies who would have induced him to retract the cause of virtue and truth. He entered upon a high encomium of Huss and declared he was ready to follow him in the glorious task of martyrdom. He then touched upon the most defensible doctrines of Wycliffe and concluded with observing that it was far from his intention to advance anything against the state of the Church of God, that it was only against the abuse of the clergy he complained, and that he could not help saying it was certainly impious that the patrimony of the Church, which was originally intended for the purposes of charity and universal benevolence, should be prostituted to the pride of the eye in feast, foppish vestments, and other reproaches to the name and profession of Christianity. The trial being over, Jerome received the same sentence that had been passed upon his martyred countrymen. In consequence of this, he was, in the usual style of popish affectation, delivered over to the civil power, but as he was a layman, he had not to undergo the ceremony of degradation. They had prepared a cap of paper painted with red devils, which being put upon his head, he said, quote, "Our Lord Jesus Christ, when he suffered death for me, a most miserable sinner, did wear a crown of thorns upon his head, and for his sake I will wear this cap." End quote. 2 days were allowed him in hopes that he would recant, in which time the Cardinal of Florence used his utmost endeavors to bring him over, but they all proved ineffectual. Jerome was resolved to seal the doctrine with his blood, and he suffered death with the most distinguished magnanimity. In going to the place of execution, he sang several hymns, and when he came to the spot, which was the same where Huss had been burnt, he knelt down and prayed fervently. He embraced the stake with great cheerfulness, and when they went behind him to set fire to the faggots, he said, quote, "Come here, and kindle it before my eyes. For if I had been afraid of it, I had not come to this place." End quote. The fire being kindled, he sang a hymn, but was soon interrupted by the flames. In the last words he was heard to say these, quote, "This soul in flames I offer, Christ, to thee." End quote. The elegant Poggi, a learned gentleman of Florence, secretary to 2 popes, and a zealous but liberal Catholic, in a letter to Leonard Aretin, bore ample testimony of the extraordinary powers and virtues of Jerome when he emphatically styles, quote, "a prodigious man." End quote.